We're talking about data deficits and how to answer questions that your audiences may have about vaccines before they've been asked. If you're new to the course, as some of you may be, we are First Draft. We are a global organization based in London, New York, and Sydney, Australia, working to provide people and institutions with the knowledge and tools to fight misleading and harmful information. This is an all new course, so we're super excited to have you. My name is Shade Nair-Bani. I'm Partnerships and Programs Manager for First Draft based in New York City, and that's my Twitter handle if you want to find me on Twitter, but we'll also have information about how to contact us at the end of this presentation. So let's jump right into it. We're going to cover three things today. We're going to talk about data deficits, what they are. We're going to talk about prebunking as a method for answering questions before misinformation kind of takes hold and spreads. And then we're going to give you 7 practical ideas for getting ahead of misinformation. So I wanted to start with a little case study. I'm sure all of you are familiar with some of the recent events with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. If you're not, basically what happened was in the last week or so, I guess a little bit more than a week, Johnson & Johnson vaccine distribution was halted in the US at least. And there were 6 women who reported issues of blood clotting with the vaccine. And so as a proactive measure, to research this, understand what was happening, Johnson & Johnson distribution was halted. If you were familiar with the AstraZeneca rollout in Europe and some other locations around the world, there was sort of similar concern over blood clotting as a possible side effect with that vaccine as well. And if you look on Twitter and Facebook and social media, there are tons of people who are very concerned about blood clotting as a possible side effect. And there's no end to sort of the speculation and rumors about it. So if you look to the right of the screen, we have some examples of people talking about AstraZeneca. This user, Emma, says, to everyone arguing with us over the AstraZeneca clot risk versus contraceptive pill clot risk, yes, we understand the risk of fatality is different. We understand that the clots are different. The point is there are risks. Right. So there's been sort of this discourse comparing clot risk of the vaccine to clot risk for contraceptives and sort of the effect of the vaccine on women and what that means for women. Right. And this was another video that sort of circulated, is very popular, from Dr. Michael Yeadon, who has been someone who has shared vaccine misinformation in the past. And this was a very misleading video about Johnson & Johnson because it basically compares that vaccine to the technology of Pfizer and Moderna, which you may know is it's a very separate technology. Pfizer and Moderna are mRNA vaccines. Johnson & Johnson is a bit different. So it was misleading in its comparison. But, one of the things that happens that can be very difficult to deal with is that when these events occur, and new symptoms emerge that we don't have a lot of information about, at least not a lot of well-researched, credible information, there's often sort of a mix of reporting that comes out in that interim before there's credible information that can be very anecdotal. So what do I mean by that? Here's an example of an article from ABC7. The headline was, "Women who received Johnson & Johnson vaccine concerned over extremely rare blood clotting cases." And what was notable about this article is that most of the information at the top of the article and the quotes that were being given were quotes just from women who were concerned. In other words, the quotes weren't from medical experts. They weren't from people who were explaining why the vaccine was halted. It sort of focused on that, man on the street, regular person and their perspective, which can be very valuable, of course, in an article. But in the absence of information about what this possible side effect means for people can also mean that there's kind of a too much of a focus on fear, right? So if you read these quotes, they go like this. I'm a little concerned just because blood clots are really concerning, especially as a woman. Or you hear all these medical advisors saying it's safe, take whatever one you can, and then having news come out of nowhere is a little concerning, right? So in the absence of more information about what this means, you have this reporting that sort of just focuses on these anecdotes and the fear of people about the vaccine, right? Here's sort of another interesting thing that came out that is relevant to this. So this person, Ellie Bell on Twitter, says, I have so many questions about what the hell they put in the vaccines that are making mine and everyone I know's periods so much worse and painful than usual, making people who haven't gotten a period in years menstruate suddenly. So again, with this theme of how does a vaccine affect women? Now, what we did was we did a little search for what information there was about vaccines and periods prior to April 5th, which was sort of the date in which more and more reporting started to come out about vaccines and possible side effects on women. And what was notable about these search results is that they were very sparse. When you look for just something simple like vaccine periods on Google prior to April 5th, there is very, very little information about the connection between those things, or really much at all on the possible side effects that might be particular to women. Here's an example of one article that did surface for this date, April 5th. It's an article from the Detroit News saying, can the vaccine make your period worse? These women say yes. And again, this article is focusing on personal anecdotes from people and sort of their speculation about the vaccine. And again, the problem with that is that it's not data-based, and it doesn't really give you an idea of how to, as a consumer, assess the level of risk to you with the vaccine, right? Which is what people are looking for, right? They're looking for, information that's going to help them understand whether these things are safe, right? So this is what we call an example of a data deficit. A data deficit is when the supply of credible information doesn't meet the demand. So in this case, we have the topic of Johnson & Johnson and blood clotting. We also have this general topic of women and how do the vaccines affect women. And there are lots of questions about it, but there aren't yet clear answers coming from credible sources, right? So we call that gap a data deficit. And this is kind of sort of a basic outline of how data deficits emerge. So what happens is a novel or previously niche issue surfaces. People have questions about it. They're looking for legitimate information, but it's not there, right? And maybe even the information that is there is false or misleading or confusing, right? So that's when we say a deficit emerges. The problem with this is this gap of credible information makes it much easier for malicious actors to exploit that and spread misleading information sort of in the absence of the good information to fill the gaps, right? So what can we do, right? Well, the first step is sort of to be able to identify what a data deficit is, right? So there are some things that you can look out for if you're trying to identify these things. So one is thinking about, is an issue novel, right? Is this something new, previously unknown, where we don't have a lot of information about it yet? Is it technically complex, right? So often, what happens with the vaccines, which are, a lot of it has to do with medical research and understanding the medical research that surrounds it. Very difficult to understand, right? It's technically complex. So that, creates an opportunity for there to be information that does not quite connect with readers and help them understand what's going on, right? Issues that align with pre-existing narratives, right? So if you joined us for the beginning of this course, we talked about common vaccine narratives that we see on social media, like concern about the influence of politics, concern about the influence of profit, right? So if there's an issue that sort of fits into these pre-existing narratives, then it's probably more likely that there's going to be that gap of credible information, right? And then other things as well. Is it politically salient? Is it emotionally charged? Or is it just an area of legitimate questioning, right? So these are all different things that we can think about to help us spot where possible data deficits are. So what can we do, right? Well, one thing that we're going to focus on today is this idea of prebunking. So you may have heard of debunking, right? Correcting misinformation once it's spread and goes out there. But there's also prebunking, right? And this is based on the concept that misinformation is really hard to slow down, right? If you joined us for our last course, we talked about this idea of the continued influence effect. It's this idea that even after you've corrected misinformation and you've changed someone's belief, it doesn't necessarily change someone's behavior. It continues to have this influence on the person, right? So it's this idea that misinformation is very sticky. It tends to be compelling. It's very hard to slow it down once it's out there. So the alternative then is getting ahead of misinformation. And that's what we call prebunking. So thinking of ways to find proactive measures to sort of fight the misinformation before it gets out there. So we're going to talk now about how to do this, right? So what are 7 ideas for getting ahead of misinformation? If you are in the position of working at a media company, being a journalist, reporter, and editor, or if you work in public health as a public health communicator, these are some ideas that you can sort of take back with you and think about to help produce content that is going to prepare your audience for misinformation instead of constantly trying to react to misinformation and correct the record after it's been meddled with, right? So, number 1, warning people that misinformation is coming helps protect them from it. So, even just at the level of saying to your audiences, hey, you're likely to see misinformation about this topic. That sort of turns people's minds on and gets their critical thinking skills ready and prepared for the possibility of seeing misinformation so that when they do come across it, they have that moment to think, oh, maybe what I'm seeing isn't true, right? This is something that has been written about in a number of places, but if you're interested in reading some of the research behind it, here's one source you can look at. This is the Policy and Internet Journal, Volume 12, number 2, has some great writing on this topic. And if you are registered for these courses, as you guys know, you receive the list of readings afterwards as well. That comes out at the end of the week, and there's some information linked in those readings as well. So moving on, look for questions that people are asking, right? So when news breaks or a novel issue emerges, people tend to ask questions about it on social media. So if you're trying to prepare and get ahead of spreading misinformation, one thing that you can do is to quickly identify what those questions people are asking are, right? So we talked at the beginning of this course about Boolean search queries and thinking about smart keywords, right? So one thing you may not know you can do is you can add a question mark as a search term in your search queries. So for example, if you typed into Twitter, vaccine and delay and Canada and question mark, you're going to see tweet results that mention these words, but all also include a question mark, right? So there's some tricks for being able to identify questions on social media just through the search tools that we're using. If you look at this tweet, this is one of the tweets that comes up if you do that search, and it says, if the UCP is so worried about the delay in vaccines, then why won't they give Albertans access to Canada's COVID-19 exposure notification app? If it's really about saving lives, why aren't they doing everything possible? So it's just something you might want to incorporate into your monitoring, right? Like set up your search dashboards so that you are thinking about the words that people might be using when they're asking questions about a particular topic, right? And constantly going back to those queries and sort of tweaking them so that you're keeping up with the developing news. Here's another really quick and useful thing that you can do. Do a search on Google or YouTube on a particular topic and take note of what the search results are. So this is basically a way to identify what is the information that comes up when people do searches. So for example, if you do a search for vaccine injury on YouTube, and this screenshot was taken from like a couple weeks ago, so maybe a little bit different now, but one of the things that you'll find is that a lot of the videos that come up are these stories that are essentially personal anecdotes, right? So we have mom fights to improve vaccine injury program, heartbroken parents vaccination plea, Angela Black's vaccine injury, and of course, one of the things that all of these videos have in common is this very sort of disturbing, compelling imagery of people who claim to have had vaccine injuries. And one of these, in fact, is a pro-vaccine story about a set of parents who are very supportive of vaccines. But what all of them share in common, regardless of where they're coming from ideologically, is this focus on the personal anecdote, right? And so there's actually sort of this lack of information on YouTube that quickly puts the risk of vaccines and the real risk of vaccines or lack thereof into context for people, right? So something that you can do on any topic, right? Go to a search platform, go to YouTube, go to Facebook, see what exists when people come up in your area in particular as well, if you're coming from sort of a local perspective. Another thing that you can do sort of related to the first piece of advice is think about the search queries people will use, right? So when you're doing these searches to see what comes up, think about the things people are actually going to be searching for, right? So if we're talking about vaccines and periods, right? And how the vaccines might affect periods, that's something that you could search, right? You could also search vaccines women, right? Women, Johnson and Johnson side effects, vaccine injury, right? So trying to get in the mind of a person who is asking questions about a particular topic so that we can see what the landscape of information actually looks like and be better informed to create good information that fills those gaps. Number 5, know where people are talking, right? So this goes back to the concept we talked about during our monitoring section of being able to identify the spaces online where people are having these conversations, right? So maybe you live in a country where Twitter is not actually a popular venue for people to talk, right? Maybe it's Facebook, right? What are the groups on Facebook where people are talking about vaccines and asking about vaccines? I did a little search here for groups on Facebook that were based in New Jersey that were likely to have questions about vaccines. And in particular, I wanted to find groups of Spanish speakers, see what the Spanish speaking community of New Jersey was saying. That's not too hard to do if you know how to do a simple site search. So for those of you who may not have been at our session when we talked about this, you can do a search that is within a particular URL by adding site : at the top of your search. So if you search site : facebook.com/groups and then keywords that you're interested in, it will search Facebook groups for your list of keywords. So the example I have here is New Jersey and información and some words related to coronavirus and the vaccine. And sure enough, one of the groups that popped up was this one, Grupo New Jersey COVID-19 Info y Vacunas. And you can see it has 190 members. So doing some work to understand where people are asking these questions can be helpful. Another thing that you can do is make a tip line, right? So sometimes it's hard to search the web for questions about the vaccines. You may also come from a news outlet or an organization where you don't really have the time and resources to set up these robust monitoring systems. Well, one thing that you can do is set up a tip line or even just an email inbox for people to send in their questions that they have about vaccines. So this is something that the Knoxville News Sentinel did, a little branch of the USA Today network in the States. This headline says, answering your questions about COVID-19 vaccinations. Let us know what you want to know. So if you feel like you're not in touch with what your audience is asking or what they're searching for, ask them, right? Either set up a tip line, it could be on WhatsApp, it could be on email, it could be something else, and try to get that engagement with your audience. And speaking of engagement with your audience, bolster your social media presence if you have the resources to do so, right? So there are a lot of different ways to do this. So for example, if you are coming from the States and you are in a place that has a lot of Reddit engagement, right? Reddit is actually a very popular website, at least in the United States, for people to talk in forums and ask questions. I remember during the lead up to the US 2020 election, in particular, Florida and the forums related to Florida were hugely popular for people talking about politics and asking questions about the election, right? So that might be something to explore. And if it's something that's interesting to you, you can set up an AMA or an Ask Me Anything to sort of build that engagement with your audience and have a way to directly answer questions that people are asking. And if you're interested in that, Reddit actually has a whole site on their page where they talk about media partnerships, and they have a whole media partnerships toolkit. So that might be something to do. But if Reddit isn't something that's big where you're coming from, maybe do a Facebook or Instagram live, right? And the idea behind this, of course, is that these are the spaces where the misinformation is circulating, right? So if you're finding that there's tons of misinformation on local Facebook groups, then it might be in your interest to try to engage with some of those people on Facebook. Of course, this can be very complicated. It depends on your organization. It's probably something you should have a protocol around, or a social media strategy around. But we bring it up because it can be very surprising to certain organizations to find out that so much of the discourse about vaccines and the questions people are asking are very much living and breathing in these social media spaces. So you can use your own platform to talk about vaccines as much as you want, but another strategy is to go to those spaces themselves and decide if you want to have engagement there as well. So to sort of sum up, one of the takeaways we want you guys to have from this session is that there's a bit of a difference between checking facts and building trust, right? So the classic debunk, right, or fact check does a couple of things very well. One of the things that it does is it appeals to source credibility, right? So sort of says to an audience, we are a credible source on information, so come to us to read this fact check and get the record straight, right? Also tends to focus on experts, right? Who are the experts on this source? How can we highlight their voices in this debunk or this fact check, right? And that can work very well for certain kinds of audiences. What it doesn't work very well with is people who don't naturally have that that trust in either your organization or necessarily even that trust in elite sources of information, or official sources of information, right? We talk about a lot this sort of crisis of trust in news, crisis of trust in institutions, right? So appealing to source credibility doesn't necessarily solve that problem, right? So the other idea that we can build on is this idea of building trust with audiences, right? And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that using these methods of prebunking and some of the things we talked about in the last sessions about effective reporting as well. So addressing concerns and avoiding ridicule, right? So understanding what are the questions people are asking, understanding what are the root concerns of these issues, right? Affirming and developing the audience's critical thinking, and identifying the trusted sources of an audience. So not necessarily the expert or the elite sources, but trying to identify who it is that your audience does trust, right?